Hello, everyone. We are just about ready to get started. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to today's webinar. For our attendees based in the US, hope everyone had a nice Thanksgiving and is getting back into the swing of things. So first, before we get started, a couple of housekeeping notes. I'm Amy and I am the resident webinar host around these parts. We are recording today's webinar, so everyone who registered will receive a link to the recording tomorrow morning, so you'll be able to revisit the content or share it with your team. Second, we will have time for some questions today, so as Justin is talking, if you have questions, go ahead and type them into that questions box, and I will pass them over to Justin at the end. And I think that's about it. So without further ado, let's meet today's guest. I'm so excited that we are joined today by Justin Dilley, FullStory's VP of Product. Justin, thank you so much for taking the time to join.
Yeah, absolutely, Amy. Appreciate the getting this all set up and excited that we've got a handful of folks live on the webinar here. And for those, as Amy mentioned, for those that weren't able to attend live, we'll have a nice recording that folks can use and get the same content and information. And as Amy mentioned, feel free to queue up any questions and I'll do my best to answer them towards the end. And so this is a topic that I have been really passionate about as someone that's been in the product management field for quite a while. And it's something that doesn't get a lot of attention and is easy to gloss over. And so the title of this webinar is How to Build Better Customer Experiences or Products by Focusing on the Why. And so my hope for you guys attending here is that this is both a mix of real world practical content from my own experiences and a little bit of theory or things to think about as you take hopefully some of these learnings back to your team and your teams and your company. But I'm going to start out by telling a relatively brief story that I think highlights a lot of what can go right and what can go wrong when you don't actually focus on the why here. And so this fine, distinguished gentleman here is Cyril Northcote Parkinson. He is a British naval historian. He wrote, I think, about 60 books in the late 50s, early 60s, and he spent the better part of his career figuring out how to understand large bureaucratic organizations. So not surprisingly, government organizations like the British Navy are a really interesting case study to understand how people make decisions, how work ultimately gets done. And so he published a best-selling book called Parkinsons Law in 1957, in which he's most famous for the theory that work expands so as to fill the time available for its completion. And I think anybody in the working world can probably really relate to that, where you're given a certain amount of time and you rush to complete it, or the work really just expands to fill the time that you actually have available, whether that's 1 day, 1 hour, or 1 week. But he's actually more famous in the product management world for this other theory. So this is Parkinson's Law of Triviality. And so I've kind of co-opted this. And his quote, or really what this theory is centered around, is that time spent on anyone, I put in brackets, their product decision, will be an inverse proportion to the impact of that decision. And hopefully everybody has had a experience like this or two where you're discussing or you're debating something related to creating or building a product, and you end up getting really sidetracked on some of the things that maybe ultimately won't actually impact your ability to deliver or build a great product. And so I'm going to bring this home with a story that he tells in his book that I think is a really good representative example of how this can go awry at some companies sometimes. So you have to transport yourself back to 1950s, 1960s England, and he tells this story about a small coastal town in the northern part of Britain that is having a community meeting, and they're meeting to discuss three specific topics. And this is, your traditional community meeting where you have community leaders up on front of the stage and you have the community in the audience, and they're going to vote on three specific initiatives. And so there'll be some discussion, hopefully some debate, and then ultimately some agreement on how to move forward on these three decisions. So the first decision, the background is the meeting is about an hour and a half and an hour and 45 minutes. They have to get through these three agenda items. And the first one is definitely the biggest one. And so the town is deciding if they should allow the creation and construction of a nuclear power plant. And as you can probably imagine, for a relatively small town, this is a really, really big decision. So this is about a 10 million pound number, which in the late 50s, early 60s is about 250 million to 300 million US dollars. And so for a small town, it is a really, really big decision. But unexpectedly, this passes without a lot of discussion. And so one of the committee members proposes kind of a different plan, which nobody is really willing to accept because they honestly just don't understand it. And there are a few people in the audience and the community members that have questions and some concerns, but they don't understand the real complexities. And so they don't feel like they can really raise their hand. And so about 5 or 10 minutes goes by and everybody votes in favor of the creation of this nuclear power plant. The second decision, now that they've decided to create and build this nuclear power plant, is what sort of bike shed should they build outside of the nuclear power plant? So this is a small British coastal town. A lot of people ride their bikes to work. And so while this is a decision, it's not a really, really big decision. And as you can imagine, the committee should be able to easily decide on this. But the debate goes on for about 30 or 45 minutes, again, of the hour and a half agenda. And if you've heard the term bike shedding before, as you're thinking about building and creating products and experiences, this is where I think that term actually comes from. And so the debate is a pretty vigorous debate. So people want a specific design in mind, and the committee and community members go through trying to say, should this be a big structure, a small structure? What should the materials of the structure should be? Should it be this nice, beautifully glass enclosed bike shed, or should it be something more simple with an asbestos roof? That was actually a decision they had to make back in the early 60s. And all told, this was about a 350-pound decision. And so you can imagine that most people can understand what a bike shed is, what some of the major design elements of a bike shed would be, and certainly the amount of money is not an astronomical amount that people can really actually dig in and debate this, even though this isn't the most important decision on the agenda. So this goes by for about 45 minutes, and they ultimately decide on a design for the bike shed. So they're going to build this beautiful tall bike shed with the galvanized roof instead of the asbestos roof, thank goodness. It's going to house about 20 to 25 bikes. And so the community and committee rings the gavel on that and decides to move on to the last and probably the easiest decision that they have to make all day. And so this very last decision is centered around, should they provide free coffee, tea, and snacks at these community meetings? So these community meetings happen quarterly, I believe, and there was a proposal at the last community meeting around providing some refreshments for folks. And so this feels like a relatively small decision. I think it was in the 100 pound for the entire year type of decision. So a relatively low cost thing that people can really sink their teeth into and try and say, is this the right decision or is this the wrong decision? But should be relatively easy to decide on. And so there's 40 minutes left in the meeting, and the community and committee takes the last 40 minutes of the meeting discussing and debating, should they provide this in general? If they do decide to provide this, should they provide tea or coffee or both? Should they have little snacks available for people, crumpets and the like, the typical snacks of the early 60s? And so they actually end this hour and 45-minute community meeting without having decided on this last agenda item. And so they ultimately have to wait an entire quarter, and this becomes item number 1 on the agenda. So they have gone through an hour and 45-minute meeting and quickly decided to build a nuclear power plant, spent some time trying to decide what the design of a bike shed should be, and then ultimately couldn't decide on providing simple beverages and refreshments for these community meetings. And I think this happens more frequently than we would probably like to admit in our jobs as product managers or designers or engineers or folks that just simply have a stake in building great products and great customer experiences, where it's really easy to get focused on some of the things that maybe don't matter as much as some of the really big decisions, like, why are we doing this thing? And I think if you looked at the typical product development process today, it looks something roughly like this. You spend 10% of your time thinking about and defining the problem, maybe 10 or 15% of your time prioritizing the problem, and then the bulk of your time and energy is spent around designing, developing, testing, and shipping that problem. And that process probably, and rough time frame, probably looks the same at most organizations, where 80% of your time is spent executing on the thing you want to go do, so design, developing, testing, and 20% of your time is spent defining and prioritizing that problem. What I am here to propose to you all today, and one of the things that I hope you take away from this webinar here, is that you should actually spend much more time crisply defining what the problem is, and then prioritizing that problem among the number of things that every organization that you guys work at is dealing with on a daily basis. And then you can still spend 60% of your time designing, developing, testing, and shipping that solution, but having more of a balance between the design, develop, test, ship, and defining and prioritizing these problems, I think will make a much better experience for you guys as product people. And so I'm going to break this next 2 sections into these first 2 parts here. So how can you really get better at defining the problem? And then what are some practical tools and tips to actually be able to prioritize that problem? And so we'll start with defining the problem. And there's this really great quote from Albert Einstein that says, if he were given 1 hour to save the planet, he would spend 59 minutes defining the problem and 1 minute trying to resolve it. And I think we probably heard the old adage that, no problem has survived its definition before. But I think as product professionals, we don't spend enough time really digging into what the problem our customers or users have. And again, this Albert Einstein quote really reinforces how much time are we spending as product people defining what the problem is. Ultimately, there is a number of solutions to any given problem, but having a really well-defined problem is what can set you up to be the most successful in being able to solve that problem. And so you probably get asked this a lot at your organizations. And so organizations typically ask people, hey, look, you need to think outside the box. But what you should be really asking yourselves is how to find more descriptions of the box. And so there's a really great quote from the Harvard Business Review that talks about it is less about thinking outside of a box, but really thinking about how do you define what the box should be. And there's no one better at this from an innovation standpoint than James Dyson. So if you don't know the backstory on James Dyson, he's obviously the inventor of the Dyson vacuum and now Dyson line of consumer products. But his radical insight about how to design a vacuum didn't come from the traditional vacuum industry. So James Dyson actually has an industrial manufacturing background. And so when he looked at this particular problem, he thought about it in a very different way. So he thought about, what is the fundamental thing a vacuum is ultimately trying to do? And it turns out that what a vacuum actually does at the most fundamental level is sucks in air and dirt and then tries to separate the air from the dirt. And so in a traditional bag, or now in a bagless vacuum, the bag does all of the heavy lifting in terms of separating the air from the dirt. And so it was this insight, the concept or idea, that if you could find a better way to separate air from dirt, you could actually create a much better vacuum for people. And so bags do this by essentially acting as a filter, but there are a lot of other ways to separate particles from air. And so James Dyson used his knowledge of industrial manufacturing and realized that industrial cyclones actually create a mass of spinning, or a spinning mass of air that throws particles to the edges of the canister here by centrifugal force. And so it was this key insight, and he was able to turn that into an entire product line and a huge company that's worth, probably tons of money at this point. And so it was really this insight of separating dirt from air and thinking not outside the box, but how to actually define what the box is. Again, for him, getting to that root cause of what is a vacuum ultimately trying to do, or what is that problem that a vacuum is solving for customers. And so he was able to flip that whole model on its head with this simple phrase of, how do you separate dirt from air in the best possible way? And so if you want some real practical approaches to how to take this and understand how to define the why and how to really get to the heart of a problem, I'm going to posit that if you start with something simple, and I've got the simple equals solvable, which I'm a big believer in, but if you start with this simple statement that says we are looking for X in order to achieve Y as measured by Z. And if you take that simple statement and try and fill in the X, Y, and Z here for your organization or your problem or your particular product that you're trying to develop, you can start to really break any given problem down into its most useful components. And so we're going to take a look at this, and I'll give you guys some tips and tricks on how to make this happen. And again, so I'll break down this statement into its three parts, starting with, we are looking for X. So what, as an organization, are we really trying to achieve from any given experience or product? What's the outcome we're really looking for here? And practically thinking about that and writing that down in a way that you can crisply say, we are looking for X. One of the ways to get to the heart of what you're really looking for is to use the jobs to be done framework. And if you're not familiar with the jobs to be done framework, there is a ton of content and a ton of learning out there, but this is a framework developed from Clayton Christensen's work with McDonald's. And so there's this really great story that I'll give you guys a little bit of insights into here that hits home exactly how powerful the jobs to be done framework can be. So McDonald's, huge company, massive marketing and research budget, was struggling to try and increase the sales of their milkshakes. They tried a bunch of different things. They tried changing the formula, they tried changing the recipe, they tried changing the price. Typical marketing maneuvers that you would try and do to increase sales. But none of these things actually worked. And so they hired Clayton Christensen and his team to really help understand why they couldn't increase milkshake sales. And so Clayton Christensen and his team immediately went into the field and they tried to figure out, like, who is the ultimate target customer? What is the profile of the quintessential milkshake customer? And actually Clayton Christensen talks about it in this great video that he felt like he was really the perfect profile in a lot of ways. And so, but he couldn't understand what would make him buy more milkshakes. And so his team went into the field and they ended up talking to hundreds of customers about their habits around buying a milkshake or deciding not to buy a milkshake. And when they asked the simple question of, what are you hiring a milkshake to do for you? This simple question created a ton of insights for the organization. And so they would camp out at gas stops and rest stops and gas stations, and they would try and understand why people were buying milkshakes in general. And they asked them this simple question, and what they heard profoundly was that people were hiring milkshakes to ultimately get by on their daily commutes. And so one of the things that they found was people wanted a milkshake as kind of like a breakfast replacement. And so they would ask people who weren't buying milkshakes what the job they were hiring any given piece of food for them was. And some of the people said, well, you know, I hired this banana, but it didn't really meet my needs, or I hired this Snickers bar, but you know, it ultimately left me incredibly unsatisfied. And when he would ask people about the job to be done for a milkshake, they found that people wanted to consume something that had, you know, some heft to it that would ultimately fill them up, but that was a distraction as well on their long commute. And so they found out the people that were, you know, had the right profile to buy a milkshake were going on, you know, an hour commute in the morning, and they wanted something to kind of waste the time and be a little bit of a breakfast replacement, if you can call a milkshake a breakfast replacement. But it was this insight that Clayton Christensen and his team took back to McDonald's, and they ultimately changed the packaging of the milkshake itself and then the formula. So they made it a lot thicker, a little bit harder to actually consume, so it lasted a little bit longer with their customers' commute. And this insight led to a huge increase in milkshake sales over the following years for McDonald's. And so they were able to ultimately expand the size of the milkshake market by focusing it on being a breakfast replacement, more or less, for its customers. And this was a really keen insight using the jobs to be done framework that helped McDonald's achieve a ton of success and increase sales of their milkshake lines. How we do this at FullStory is we take the jobs to be done framework and we look at it through a customer empathy lens. And so if you don't know anything about FullStory, we're a digital customer experience platform that helps our customers understand their users' digital experiences. And so one of the things that we do is we use our own product to understand how our customers are interacting with FullStory, the product that we're delivering. And so what we do is we set up these monthly, we call them game film sessions. So as a product team, we all get in a room and we have a specific topic in mind, and we go through and we start to dig into the data and start to ultimately watch how customers are experiencing the products that we're delivering. Now, this gives us a couple different things. One, we can really start to think about what the job these users or customers are ultimately hiring us for, and then back that up with some of the quantitative and qualitative insights of our product. And so what you're seeing here on the screen is we just recently, or relatively recently, launched a new product called Conversions. And so we launched the product, we waited a few weeks, we gathered a bunch of data, and then we ultimately sat in a room and watched how customers were experiencing this particular product that we launched. And it was incredibly insightful for a number of reasons. One, you can see how customers are interacting in real time with something. So you can put yourself in their shoes, and all of the wins and winces, as we call them, are on display. And so as a product manager, this is something that I find is a great way to try and get inside the minds of your customers so that you can think about that jobs to be done framework, but also empathize with the experiences, empathize with them regarding the experiences that you're delivering to them. And so this is a real practical way that we do this at FullStory to try and help our customers, and again, ultimately get to the why of any given customer problem. And so now we'll go on to the second part of that simple statement. So in order to achieve why. So really thinking about what the benefit to the organization is. How does this particular product or feature or functionality fit within a company's strategy or approach? What constraints are we operating in? And there's this really great visual that I think if you don't have one for your product or your company, it is really worth trying to develop a little bit of this mental model where you have your values at the top, kind of what do you stand for as a company or as a product in general, and then that comes down to a vision where you're trying to think about where are we ultimately going from a direction standpoint, and then the mission of your product or company, what do we actually do, why do we do it, and who do we do it for? And then thinking about the strategic objectives underneath that and how are you actually going to get to the mission that you've set out? And then what are some of the tactics, actions, and KPIs that will help you on that strategic objective? And so you get on the left side there, you see, the spectrum of kind of strategic and tactical up to achievable, all the way up to aspirational. And so this is just a really simple, easy to use framework that you can take away and you can do tomorrow. And so how this works at FullStory, we've got our company mission, we've got our own product mission and strategy, and then we use the OKR process, which I'll talk about in a little bit, to think through what our strategic objectives and key results and KPIs are for the year, for the quarter, for any given time frame at FullStory. You might be asking yourself, well, I've got a roadmap, I've got a strategy, I understand where I'm trying to go. And so really at the end of the day, your roadmap is not related to your strategy. You want your mission to be your intended destination. So I'm trying to drive from here to New York as a practical example. And then you want your strategy to be how you intend to get there. So I'm going to take Highway 80 East, for example. And then your roadmap really is the themes and intentions around the details of how you think you're ultimately going to get there. So in this car example, what kind of car am I actually going to drive on 80 East to get to New York? Might be one thing on my roadmap. But what I see a lot and what I hear from a lot of folks is I've got a roadmap, so therefore I've got a strategy. Those two things are actually very, very different. And so you should really think about separating those, and they certainly complement one another. But if you don't have a intended product or feature type strategy, you're going to be operating in a little bit more of an ambiguous world, and it won't allow you to get to that ultimately that why and get to the problem you're trying to solve and give you that map, if you will, of how to get from here to New York and what highway you're going to take, but by defining what kind of car you're actually going to drive there. And so the last part of that statement is as measured by Z. So of course you have to be able to measure what actually matters. And so if you can't measure it, it probably won't matter. And so when you think about the things you're doing as an organization, how are you measuring success? And so for any given product or experience, not only thinking about the details and what you're going to build and why you're going to build it, but ultimately, how are you going to measure success or how are you going to measure failure? And I mentioned at FullStory, we use OKRs pretty extensively. And so how we hold ourselves accountable and how we measure our progress against some of the key objectives that we have is through this really simple model. So at the beginning of the year, we set out and we define a set of annual company-wide objectives and key results. And so we call it the year in preview. And so every January, February, we announce to the company what the annual OKRs for the company will be. And then we take those annual OKRs and we break them down into company level quarterly OKRs. And so each quarter, we will then define a more specific set of objectives and key results that ladder up to our annual objectives and key results. And so these are going to have a little bit more definition to them, and so they're going to be focused and specific on a given quarter. But again, still sticking with defining the objectives and key results that make it back into the annual set of objectives and key results we have. And then within each quarter, we break it down into 2 6-week cycles. And so each family or each organization at FullStory takes a look at the quarterly company and annual company OKRs and says, okay, how can I most impact those OKRs? And so you'll see a set of these 6-week planning exercises that each family goes through, both cross family, so marketing and product and sales and our success organization, thinking about how do all of these things interact with one another, but what are the contributions that I can make as a product organization. These are the things that I think a lot about that helps us achieve a specific quarterly objective and a set of key results, or an annual objective and a set of key results. So here's a super practical example of an objective that we have here at FullStory. So we have an annual objective to increase our North Star metric. And so we define our North Star metric as weekly active explorers. And so we have found that weekly active explorers is the best measure for us in terms of understanding how customers get value out of using FullStory. And so this is really about driving increased engagement with our product as measured by our North Star metric called weekly active explorers. And so a key result for that objective might be something like increase our weekly active explorer rate from X to Y. And so we then will score that key result on a score from 0 to 1, and then we will check, and that is how we hold ourselves accountable. And that's how we measure if we're making the biggest impact possible for any given objective and any given key result. And so another, super product specific objective might be something like successfully launch our new awesome product or feature. One of the key results there might be meet our beta exit criteria by X date. And then again, we'll get a score, we'll score ourselves on that. And then this becomes the way we measure some progress on the product team. And so not everything that we do is related to OKRs. OKRs are really meant to up-level the entire company or the entire product organization here at FullStory. And so we typically have a small number of objectives and key results that map back to the company quarterly and annual OKRs. But this is really how we measure some of our own progress at meeting some of our own objectives, and how we measure and understand our strategic direction and how we're trying to achieve our mission and vision as a product team. So that was the first part of that. Now we're going to transition into prioritizing the problem. Again, there are a number of ways to prioritize problems and features and products when you think about the product development process. And so I'm not going to talk about every single possible approach of how that happens. And the approach that works for us at FullStory might not work for any given company, but I'll give you guys some hints on how we use what prioritization framework we use at FullStory and how that helps us think about prioritizing problems and features and initiatives among the thousands of things that we could ultimately do. But prioritization is super, super hard. I mentioned there are a number of ways to do this. No one way is the right way, but it's actually, maybe if you think about it, it's not all that hard. You just really have to focus on three things. One, solving big problems. That sounds relatively easy. If you have a lot of customers and they have a lot of problems, you just solve those big problems and you create a bunch of value for your users and customers. And that's an easy way to think about, okay, what am I going to do to create the most value for my customers through their particular problems? But if you don't maybe have a good sense of what the biggest problems are, if you simply think about helping the most number of customers, so if you have hundreds, you have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of users that all have roughly the same problem, and you set out to solve that problem and think about prioritizing based on helping the most number of customers, that's another approach that you can't really go wrong with. And then maybe the last thing is understanding the amount of impact any given change will have. And so this really is about how acute any given problem potentially is. And so if you think about a pain scale that a doctor might ask you about, where your pain level is a 0 to 10, you can ask that, or you can understand that same thing for your sets of customers. What is the amount of impact I can have and reduce their pain from an 8 to a 5, or from a 5 to a 1? And so how we do this practically at FullStory is we use this relatively simple framework called our value to effort 9-blocker. And so I mentioned we have a set of annual and quarterly objectives, both at the company level, and then that trickles down into the product. And so we get together every quarter to plan and understand what we're going to build for the next quarter, how we're going to prioritize some things, as well as it's a good check between quarter over quarter to understand what's changed in the market, what's changed about our customers, what new problems have cropped up that we're seeing from our customer base. But this exercise, this quarterly product prioritization exercise, gives us a good sense of how do we think about solving the most important problems for the most number of customers with the highest amount of pain. And so we, as a product management organization, do a ton of research into looking at a bunch of data that we have available both inside of FullStory and outside of FullStory. So customer feedback, we've got a number of listening mechanisms that we do through our sales team or through our success team or through our support organization. And so we take all of this information and then we try and distill it down into two axes. So value on the y-axis and effort on the x-axis. And so when we go into this quarterly product prioritization meeting, we have a good sense of how valuable any given feature is or product is. And value has, a number of different currencies that don't have to just mean revenue, don't have to just mean engagement. It could be CSAT, it could be customer pain. There could be, for your organization, a way to define value that is different from how we think about it at FullStory. Effort is relatively straightforward, or at least it's easier to try and put a low, medium, high effort score on a given initiative. But what I think is important about this, and where I personally have gone wrong in the product development process, is if you just think about the effort being the engineering effort, how many engineering man months is something going to take? Certainly that's an important factor for determining the overall effort for any given product or feature. But think much more broadly about the product management, the design effort. That is an entire product team worth of effort. But then you can actually, and you should actually, expand that out further and think about, I'm in a B2B business, but you probably have other stakeholders and other constituents. And how do you both build products and then get them to market? There are a lot of other impacts on an organization and a lot more effort than just simply product managing, designing, and then creating a given product or feature. You really want to think about this as a real company-wide effort. And so when you think about your effort score in the low, medium, high, think much more broadly than the traditional kind of engineering man months, but how are we going to build this product, and then ultimately how we're going to deliver this product to the market. So in our case, being a B2B business, we have to think a lot about the product marketing aspect of this, the sales team and training them and making sure that they're up to speed on how to talk to our customers about this. How do we train the success and our support organizations to ultimately be able to make sure customers are successful and they can support and answer any questions that they have? And so it's really not just solely about building the product from an effort standpoint. It really is a company-wide impact. And you can see here, I have these little color-coded boxes. And so at the top left are the highest value, lowest effort things. I think we'd all love if we had a bunch of specific initiatives or problems that fit into that bucket. But what you ultimately find is that a lot of things fit into buckets 2 and 3 and maybe 4 and 5 here. And so I have the green as kind of where you want to spend most of your time, or at least we at FullStory want to focus on the higher value, even if it is low, medium, or high effort, or the medium value, low effort, and even some of the small wins. So it's easy to neglect kind of the low effort, low value type tasks, but setting up the team to be able to tackle those little paper cuts, those little pebbles in the shoe that ultimately annoy and distract your customers from the value you're trying to deliver them is as important as focusing on some of the bigger, hairier problems that your customers have. What I see a lot of folks and a lot of teams, and I have certainly fall prey to this, is you sometimes get into the zone of indifference, as I call it. So this is kind of boxes 6 and 7 here, where you've got a medium value, medium effort, or a medium value, high effort type task. And it's really easy to try and categorize everything in boxes 6 and 7 into this zone indifference. And so one of the things that we challenge ourselves here at FullStory is how do we move things out of boxes 6 and 7. So that might be decomposing or deconstructing the problem in a different way. That might be taking the time to reevaluate or rethink a given solution to a potential problem. And so it's really important to try and get things off the bubble. If you think about 6 and 7 are kind of these tweener type features, get things off of the bubble there so you can start to get them into and have your team focused on the higher value type activities. And then 8 and 9 are just things you should avoid at all costs. I mean, hopefully you guys are already largely doing this, but the things that are medium and high effort and low value, try and have the team stay and steer away from that. And when this is working really effectively, you get this nice motion where we've got, you know, kind of our decentralized teams, and they're thinking about using the 9 blocker as a way to frame up how they're going to prioritize things. And then within each of that, you have each stream of work or each feature or each product, the team will have the potential work that they'll prioritize within that stream. And then they'll take on, I mentioned our OKR process. We have 2 6-week cycles within each quarter. And so for cycle 1, they'll take on some portion of that higher priority work, and then cycle 2, they'll take on the second priority of stuff. And it's these swim lanes that allow you some efficiency once you've prioritized both at the highest level for the entire team, but then down into each of the sub teams, or we call them subfamilies here at FullStory, can think about using this for their own initiatives that may or may not be related to the broader company or the broader product, but you can operate with this framework in parallel. Okay, now we can get into what companies actually do really, really well, is designing, developing, testing, shipping, and then ultimately repeating that process. I mean, there's a ton of resources and success things already available for companies to operate in a sophisticated model here. There are a couple pitfalls that I'll mention. If you don't have a fully integrated product team where you have engineering, design and product management, all embedded with one another, all pulling in the same direction, you could end up with this tug of war between teams, and then that ultimately leads to products like this. And so you have these folks sitting around a table trying to say, let's see how many more features we can cram in here. And so if you don't have that truly integrated product team, you can go awry. And so I would challenge everybody here to think about the triad. And so building products with the triad. And so this is, if you're not familiar with this, this is the world unity symbol that symbolizes the body, the mind, and the spirit, in the same way that a great product team has with product management and design and engineering, and thinking about the cohesion among these teams and the different viewpoints that they bring to any given problem. It's important to have those different voices in the room, even with their different expertise. And if you don't believe me, take this data as a pretty compelling case for why cognitively diverse teams, so putting together product managers, designers, and engineers and having them solve a problem, is really an approach that you should think about taking. Not only in this study were higher cognitively diverse teams able to actually complete the task, they were able to do it in about 50% of the time. And so teams A, B, and C there, you'll see are the cognitively diverse teams versus teams D, E, and F who are not. And some of them were able to complete the task. It just took them 50% longer, but others weren't able to even complete or solve the given problem. And it's this combination of folks, designers, product managers, and engineers that really helps you think through problems in a much more effective way. Okay, we're wrapping up here, and so I want to leave you with one last quote, and this is a great quote from a gentleman named Alvin Toffler, who I think his official title is a futurist, which is just kind of an awesome title to have. But what he says is the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And it really is this process as product people that we will build better products for folks. And then when you think about undertaking the understanding of the product development process, spend some more time in that learning, unlearning, and relearning phase by focusing on the why and focusing on prioritizing the problems, and spend maybe a little bit less time in the design, build, ship process. I think it'll do a ton of benefits for everybody. I certainly have felt like it's made a world of difference here at FullStory, but also in general in my own product management career.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Justin, for taking us through that. So we do have time for a few questions today. I want to make sure to get you guys out of here on time at 2. So if you do have any questions, you can put them in the question box here, and I've got a couple here. So the first one about the 9 blocker, that framework for prioritizing, which I really love. How do you know when you have enough data to effectively place something in one of the boxes? I imagine that's probably kind of speaking especially to, understanding the potential value of something.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think first off, understanding and defining what value means is an important piece of that. And so for us at FullStory, we care a lot about, we're a SaaS business, and so we care about annual recurring revenue, but that's just one potential value metric. And if you're only looking at, one particular measurement, you're ultimately going to be optimizing for one potential outcome at the expense of other outcomes. And so how we balance that here at FullStory is we certainly want to be able to, generate kind of the business outcomes that we ultimately all want. We're a for-profit organization, but that's not the only thing we define as value. I mentioned kind of CSAT and customer feedback. And so we balance the business needs, if you will, as defined by annual recurring revenue, with wanting to drive engagement and usage among our broad customer base. And so we think a lot about how, even if something doesn't generate, a particular dollar of revenue, how can we get more folks engaged with the product? How do we get more folks engaged with a given feature? And so we measure engagement. I mentioned our North Star metric earlier on the webinar, but we think a lot about how our products and features and initiatives can drive our customer engagement up. Ultimately, we want all of our users using FullStory every day. And so even if it doesn't generate, a single dollar of revenue, but having a sense of what defines engagement for us is equally as important as thinking about the kind of business side of things. And then the last component is kind of that customer feedback. So how do we infuse the customer voice into what we think is valuable or what we define as value? And so we've got a system in place today that captures all of the feedback, or a lot of the feedback that we get from customers, and tries to aggregate that in a number of useful ways to, again, integrate that customer viewpoint into how we think about value at FullStory.
Awesome. And that's actually a perfect lead into, we got a question from Sam here that says, for a B2B startup with less historic data and less total customers to judge which new features will benefit the most number of customers, do you have any suggestions for how to prioritize in this case? So, this is, I certainly can relate, having been at FullStories from when we were but a wee startup ourselves, and trying to figure out how to understand the value and the potential impact when you just have a little bit less of that, historic data to go off of.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a ton of sense. And I think if you think about a company, or maybe even your company, in the either pre or slightly post product market fit, I think it's about understanding the problem that you're trying to solve, and then rapidly testing and iterating on the solutions that solve that problem. And so if you think about your company being a pre-product market fit company, what is the one single problem, the sliver of a problem that you think you can solve for your users, and then rapidly iterate on solutions to that and try and find ways to measure that. So that could be business growth, that could be engagement. Those are the few of the things that we care about at FullStory, but having a pragmatic approach to defining the problem, or even a thin slice of that problem, and then testing and iterating a number of solutions on that to see if the things you're doing are driving the types of outcomes that you expect or hope for. And so that could be through engagement, that could be through increased trials or signups or paid subscribers. But again, taking that problem, defining it, and then tackling a thin slice of that, and then rapidly iterating on solutions to that, even without a ton of data, I think is a pretty good pragmatic approach to try and figure out how to scale up a business in the early stages.
Yeah, and the sort of origin story of FullStory was really built for, a startup in this exact situation, where just didn't have a ton of historic data, and really trying to understand at a individual customer level what was resonating and what they were doing and what kind of problems they're trying to solve. And I think that can be really powerful to be able to go in and actually watch those sessions. That's certainly how we were using FullStory back in the day.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Awesome. And then I have, let's see, one more question here. So kind of zooming back out, I know, again, sort of from personal experience, a question that I have is, when you're in those conversations where, and you're a product manager, maybe you're not the person leading the meeting, maybe you are, but you realize that the group of people in the room that are trying to make the decisions have really grabbed a hold of the bike shed problem, or the free snacks problem, and they've missed the they have really missed the why, and you recognize that, hopefully you've attended this webinar, now you sort of see things through a different lens and you realize that. What are some tips? Maybe you are the person leading the meeting and you need to get the group back on track. What are some tips for getting your team back out to thinking about that why again?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think one of the things that you can do inside a meeting is, as people are bike shedding or rat holing on any given topic or conversation or alternative, is to try and bring it back to the problem itself. And so if you ask the pointed question, something like, how will this solve this problem? Or how will this contribute to us understanding the problem better? I find that will steer the conversation back in a much better, healthier direction. And so there are a number of different ways to kind of massage the language around that during a meeting, and it depends on obviously the dynamics of the team and the organization. But again, trying to bring everything back to, okay, how is this going to impact the problem? What is the solution that we feel like is going to solve the problem the best? And then how are we going to learn from, or how we're going to ultimately measure that? Those are the questions I think you can start to ask as you get into bike shedding type discussions, where if people don't have really good answers for those, it's a really easy way to kind of move on and focus on, okay, well, what are the things that we want to do to better understand the problem? Or what are the solutions that we're looking to evaluate, and how we're going to evaluate the success of those solutions, and try and keep the conversation centered around those topics. And again, as you're exploring the why here, I have found are good kind of just practical ways to bring the meeting back to, what is the customer's problem? How many customers have this problem? What are the potential solutions to that problem? And then creating a dynamic where people are really thinking about those elements and less about the bike shedding components. And I think what you see is people wanting to get into the details of any given solution. At least that's been my historical experience, is people want to dive into one solution and try and dissect it and try and come up with something very specific. And so I think as you start to bring that back to how this solution, or how any given solution will ultimately help solve a problem, that's a really good practical approach to trying to get the meeting back on track.
Awesome. That's really great advice. Well, I guess we're about ready to wrap things up here. Justin, thank you so much again for your time. I think this content is so valuable, and I really appreciate you taking the time to share this with us and all of our attendees today. And as I mentioned before, tomorrow morning we will send out a follow-up email to everyone who registered with a link to this recording. And I think I will also include a link to, Justin has in the past written a really nice in-depth blog post about the 9-blocker framework for prioritizing. So we'll include a link to that as well, in case you are interested in learning how that works a little bit more and getting some hands-on practice with it. So yeah, if you have any questions that you didn't get a chance to ask, please feel free to email in. You can respond to any of the webinar emails that you've received, and we will make sure those questions get answered. So thank you guys so much. Justin, thank you, and we will see you guys on our next webinar.
Thanks, Amy.
Bye.